Well, it looks like it's the people coming into the room is tapered off a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and get started just to respect everyone's time. This meeting is being recorded. The purpose of today's meeting, so at the end of last month, I did a session basically talking about things that I was proposing that were to be included in an upcoming 911 reliability rulemaking from the Public Utilities Commission. And I presented several different proposals, not competing proposals, but they were individual proposals to be considered as a slate. And because it was the first time people were hearing most of them, there was some comments and feedback available at that meeting, and I want to thank the people who were able to provide that. But because it was the first time people were hearing these proposals, it's not really a surprise that a lot of people didn't have a lot to say. So my idea today was to kind of go through those proposals again in a very abbreviated fashion. I'm not going to go into them in the level of detail that I went in the last meeting, and then pause after each one to see what people have to think about, what people think about those proposals, if they have any counter proposals or other ideas. Then we can talk about other ideas entirely that don't have anything to do with the particular proposals that you think should or could be included in the 911 rulemaking, reliability rulemaking that we will be initiating fairly soon. I'm hoping by the end of this month, but it kind of depends on a number of other factors that are out of my control. So with that, does anybody have any comments or questions before we get started? Okay. So proposal one was really the big proposal, and I had 3 pages describing it in the first workshop that I did, and here I boiled it down to 1 page. And proposal one is essentially to fund 911 network improvements through a tariff rate per concurrent session, to reimburse the governing bodies for the cost of that tariff rate through the surcharge, implement oversight mechanisms for how the funds are spent, and stipulate that funds not spent would be returned to the governing bodies. And with that, I'm just going to pause and see, because this is really the big proposal out of the group. I'm hoping that people have had some time to think about it and maybe provide me with some thoughts, concerns, suggestions. I'm all ears. Kimberly.
So, Daryl, I do have concerns, and I think it's all about details. It's also concerns with handing money over to the BESP for improvements, and so having all the details around what improvements, what are we looking at, what are those controls, who's going to truly enforce that it's done on a timeline that's been identified. There's been a lot of times that we've had well, we've looked at items, and it's hard for me to go into some of it because some of the conversations were just in our diversity discussions, but trying to figure out how we're going to add diversity to the network, make improvements on the network. There were so many different paths we can go. So when we talk about how to fund it, I get we need to fund it, but I also would almost rather have a plan, a set amount, and then we're funding it for that particular project with, again, project controls in place. So this one, I felt like I understand we need to find a way. We need to have money in order to strengthen the network, but then what does it look like? Network improvements. Are we talking about physical redundancy? Are we talking about circuits? Are we talking about getting some power up at a remote CO that maybe doesn't have power? So there's so many different ways that we can go with this, and I would say it's an idea, but I would almost rather have a particular target identified for a particular problem in the state, and that's what we're tackling, and therefore it's X amount of money, and this is how we're going to fund it. So to me, this was just a little bit too big, a broad stroke approach for me to be comfortable with.
Okay. Joe, you have your hand up?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So my thought would be that request or require CenturyLink to come in with a tariff amendment proposal, which would say, these are the projects we're going to address in this year or in this time period, and this is what the cost will be. And through kind of the tariff process, decide this is what we're going to fund. It would have to be done by October 1st so that the PUC could put that into its the statewide surcharge. And then it would also be, what is the period over which we're going to fund it? Because there are some things that might take, more money than we could raise for the surcharge at a reasonable amount within, say, a 1-year period. And so we might have to say, well, we'll set the surcharge, at a 5% increment for 3 years that will go to pay for this project. And the CenturyLink will be required to hold that money essentially in an escrow account, interest-bearing escrow account, and have approval to draw it down as it completes the project.
Okay. That's actually pretty similar to what, at least how I intended to describe. I don't know if I articulated it well, the proposal at the August meeting. But I think one difference there and I just want to explore this a little bit. So one difference there would be you're suggesting that the actual proposal on what they're going to spend the money on would be part of the tariff negotiation?
Yes. And hopefully, we have had a good collaborative relationship with Lumen, that it would continue, that we could meet with them informally and talk about what our priorities are.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think, even after having participated in all of those diversity things, I know we focused on network paths, but I don't know if there are also other portions of the 911 network where either there's not backup power supply or there's not diversity within some other piece of the whole fabric of the 911 network.
Right. Does anybody have any thoughts regarding Joe's proposal or suggestion? Kimberly, do you think that approach would alleviate a little bit of your concern regarding how the projects are developed and determined what the money is going to be spent on?
My concern again is if they draw money, and I don't mean any offense to Lumen, but they take $1 million to get X amount done and they don't get it done, are they paying it back? I mean, we would have to have really strong language in there with timeframes identified so they meet the benchmarks. And we would also have to make sure that the project is clearly identified, because we may strengthen one part of the call flow, the network, of the EZNet, but we have single-sided, we have everything going to one circuit, and that's not redundant, and then there's no point of having redundancy downstream from that. So that kind of transparency and collaboration and cooperation has to be there, or it's just throwing money at it that isn't really going to fix the problem, and we're going to believe it fixed the problem, but again, we'll have a single point of failure somewhere in that call flow. So for me, it's going to be transparency, communication, and strong controls in place that would require them to meet whatever we agree upon on that deadline, or they're going to have to pay the money back.
Well, and my suggestion was that it would be held in an escrow account. They'd put it in an escrow account. They wouldn't be able to draw that down except with PUC approval pursuant to the tariff. So, and I mean, depending on the project timelines, I don't know that I'm as concerned with in some areas, for example, if you're trying to build a line across a pass and it snows, you're going to have issues and things. But as long as the PUC has the right to confirm the work's been completed before they release money from the escrow. But they're all details that we would go into that tariff discussion negotiation.
Okay.
In a way, we're kind of kicking the can down the roads a little bit with some of those details.
Well, and to Kimberly's point too, I think, there are different kinds of points of failure, right? I mean, we've identified that most of the 911 PSAPs only have one connection to the local central office. And while that can be an issue, it's often the central office that gets isolated. So it's a cut prior to reaching the central office that causes the outage. So there might have to be some prioritization where we say, okay, not all single points of failure are the same. Let's focus on the ones that are most vulnerable first, and then maybe work on the ones that are less vulnerable at a later date.
Yeah, and so you'd probably look at vulnerability, likelihood, maybe based on past outages,
Right.
population impacted.
Some of the same things we looked at in that 911 reliability working group that we had going for a year and a half. Kimberly?
I don't mean to dominate the conversation, and I don't know if this is going to be on another screen, but I think I still have the question and concern that I didn't bring up, which is the 911 authorities pay for the diversity. However, additional network or reaching other areas of a community will strengthen a for-profit part of the house, and therefore 911's paying for it, but then CenturyLink is able to provide service and charge customers for additional connectivity that perhaps wasn't there. So that's where I also struggle. How much of it, what's the business need, should be a 911 expense.
Anybody have anything to add to Kimberly's statement before I see other people raising their hands, and I don't know if those are related to what Kimberly just said or not.
Daryl, this is Tim Kunkelman. I can speak to the issue that Kimberly raised if I don't want to cut in front of anybody else.
Yeah, I think it would flow more logically to address that before we go into other comments. So go ahead, Tim.
Well, it's certainly something that we've talked about for years, and in understanding that there is that concern of, are you just going to pay for Lumen to have a better network? But the misnomer in a lot of regard is, when we build diverse paths, it doesn't just automatically generate money. What it primarily does is just allows for different opportunities for the data traffic to move. Now, sure, we can sell some dedicated circuits over a particular path, and that does happen from time to time. But I'll take an example that, and I'll mention this tomorrow to the larger group. But we did finally finish that Cottonwood Pass project, so there is now live traffic flowing over that path. So between Gunnison and Buena Vista, there is traffic moving on a diverse path. But we're not generating any new revenue right now as a result of that, nor really will we. We might, again, sell a circuit or two to a customer that might want a dedicated path, but it's just not an automatic money generator. So I think it's sort of a misnomer that all of these paths that could be built or would be built are going to generate millions of dollars all on the backs of the 911 community. That's just not how it's going to work. Traffic's going to flow the least the path of least resistance, and that's how the traffic flows. And this will just be a new path for all kinds of traffic. So I think that while I understand the concern, I don't think it's a realistic problem that we're just going to make a bunch of money because 911 community built us a different path. And I will say that if we can't really get past that particular sticking point of there needs to be a pro rata of the expenses, there is a very strong likelihood that we would just not build it. Because if we could afford to build it today, we probably would have in many of these instances. So that's a concern that I have, is if we're going to say, well, you only get 10%, well, that probably isn't going to get built then, because we can't afford to do it.
Thank you, Tim. Jerry? Jerry Delval, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I guess maybe more a question for Timothy. Isn't there a way to, gauge the usage of a new path? Wouldn't you be able to tell us? I mean, I think that might be one of the ways where we can potentially move forward and understand how that new path that got built with 911 money, we can potentially identify, well, 50% of it is being used by 911, or 10%, or whatever, or 100% of it is being used by 911, and potentially, gauge a fair value for us and for Lumen. Just a thought.
Well, I think the problem with that is you're going to limit then what the value of this path is to the network. So yeah, much of the traffic may not be 911 traffic until it needs to be 911 traffic. But again, we're not charging, AT&T, for example, because their traffic went left instead of right on the network. Their traffic's just going to flow to however it can most efficiently get to where it needs to terminate.
Right. I guess I understand that point. I'm just saying, for even if we decide, or as a 911 community decides to, okay, let's build that path because it gives us another way to get to where we need to be, and the network is going to try to find the most efficient path from point A to point B. But even having, if we have 5 years or 3 years down the road, I don't know, it could be 10 years, of how those circuits are being used and when they're being used, then that could potentially give us a better idea for future people on how to invest the money of 911 for these redundant paths. But it's only as an informational piece.
Sure. But again, I think it's gonna hamper our opportunity if our share of the cost that the company would bear to build this path, if that share is substantial to where the company, again, we're not going to make a bunch of extra money building this path, so it would greatly hamstring the project going forward, would be my opinion on that.
And I understand that. I guess my point is, with the information, if you're able to release the information, you can show us that you're not making a bunch of money. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I guess, I'm just trying to think through, ways that building an alternate path would help CenturyLink in its commercial endeavors, not related to 911. Improved reliability in general might help CenturyLink get more customers in the future if they have a better reputation for being reliable in a certain part of the state. And if an alternate path being built also means that the CenturyLink doesn't have to upgrade a connection that was already there to handle additional traffic when the time comes, because there's already an alternate path that they can take, I suppose that would save CenturyLink money. It's really hard to imagine how we would quantify that, though, and I don't know if there are any if there's a methodology that we could use to do that. I'm not expecting a response on that from anybody. It's just me thinking out loud. Joe, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, some perspective. These are existing end offices. It's the CenturyLink interoffice network facilities. And back when AT&T was king and CenturyLink had a lot of landline customers in areas, and I know some of these areas they don't even have, they're not even the local provider, but there wasn't enough traffic, enough value being derived from that link, because enough people being served to justify the cost of putting in a diverse link from when the network was first built until now, including when it's been upgraded. And in some of these areas, I don't know what the likelihood is of there being sufficient or dramatic population growth or additional demand for service along those routes. And since there's already a line there that's carrying the 911 traffic and any other traffic, including any wireless traffic that may be originating in the area, for example, when you put in a diverse link, you're not increasing the amount of traffic coming from that area. You're just giving it an alternative route. And I think whether you're stringing fiber in the air or burying it, that's very expensive. That's why it's not there yet. There is a possibility there could be revenues from it in the future. I think, it used to be if you went out into a new area where there wasn't telephone service and you had the local telephone company extend their lines to you, or the electric company, you paid the cost of it. And if anybody came in and tapped off that line within a certain amount of time, you got your, what you paid for it cut in half, or, they would have to share the cost with you. Certainly I think the PUC now has an auditor and audit capabilities, and there might be a way to look at it. I don't think it'll be open-ended all the way into the future. I don't know if you could ever get that, but there would be a time that you could look at it, and if there had been a sufficient increase in use of revenues, maybe there could be a requirement that CenturyLink invest that amount back in addition to the money the PUC is we're putting in for correcting other, providing additional diversity to cure single points of failure. That might be an approach. But one thing we don't know is, for example, is how, and I've never looked into it, how CenturyLink is charging for those, for the type of traffic that would go over those lines. And we also want to preserve the capability, of course, for CenturyLink to not build a new facility, but lease capacity or buy indefeasible rights of usage on a new fiber link, or somebody use somebody else's facility and we've already looked at them possibly being satellite in some case and microwave in some case. So there are options, but the likelihood of additional traffic and revenue being generated because you're putting in a redundant link to a community which has not to date justified just based on commercial value to put in a redundant link is unlikely. I mean, if AT&T, when it controlled all the traffic, couldn't justify it, now you have different wireless providers, each have a piece of the traffic, and CenturyLink has a shrinking piece of the telephone traffic. They're certainly leasing their capacity to the wireless companies, but we'd have to know, how they're pricing that, I guess, to figure it out. And what I hear Tim saying is there really isn't any additional revenue they make, and I guess we'd want to confirm that.
This is Tim again. I think one of the things we talked about in the past, and I think this still is a relevant issue, is what should be built. And maybe that's how we ultimately get around this concern. It'd be one thing if every proposal we made to build in an area is 288 strands of fiber. Well, that seems like an awful lot of extra capacity and extra costs that probably don't warrant what is useful. And so maybe that's how we truly resolve it, is what's a reasonable build? What's a sort of market-driven type of build? Is it X strands of fiber? Is that 2? Is that 10, 20, 50? Whatever the increments might be. What's a typical build for whatever part of the state we're in? And maybe that's something that that's sort of the ceiling of what can be done. And then yes, we've always said we would look for alternatives. We've even just been talking about some recent stuff out on the Eastern Plains, and doing a little digging with one of the rural ILECs out there to see about some additional connectivity that maybe they could provide. So I'd say we will definitely always look at those, and maybe the other part of any project proposal is a ceiling on something that's reasonable, so that we're not always building this network that we can do all sorts of things with, selling dark fiber, leasing other capacities that have nothing to do with the need of that area for these purposes. And that's something that I think we should talk about and consider as a way around, or as a way to resolve the concern that's on the table here.
But Tim, I understand the bulk of the costs are in digging the trench or doing the horizontal boring or putting up the poles and stringing it. And I have a friend whose ranch has fiber going across it that was Williams Lumen, now owns it, and they came in and replaced it and said, well, it has a lifetime. Is that something that you're aware of, that we might have to replace this fiber after like 20 or 30 years?
I haven't really heard those kinds of things. I mean, certainly things can get damaged, and it's best to replace them. But I haven't necessarily heard that type of lifespan on that particular asset. But I also don't know how fiber was constructed in 30 years ago versus how they're constructing it today. Are there differences that make it an improvement? I don't know those kinds of answers. So
okay, thanks.
Ed Mills.
Sounds like
Ed Mills with OIT just sent a chat message that says standard is about 50 years in the ground.
Thanks, Ed.
Hey, Daryl, I have a question for Tim.
Go ahead, Patty.
Sorry, I don't have the ability to raise my hand, so if I'm cutting in line. This is Patty. Tim, I just wanted to clarify, did you say that you would still incur costs for these projects, even if we went through this tariff route?
Well, sure, we always are going to incur maintenance and upgrade type of costs for equipment and things like that. So there would always sort of be those costs. And I don't know that we've ever really talked about including those kinds of costs in these particular projects. I guess I was always believing we wouldn't, that it was more around a construction, and then based on the ability to have something constructed, it would be our responsibility to continue to maintain that asset, make it useful.
And maybe that's one approach to addressing the concern of additional value that CenturyLink might be gaining from building out these routes, is the acknowledgement that CenturyLink is taking on the responsibility of maintaining those routes into the future. Because what I've envisioned here with this proposal is non-recurring costs only, the cost of actually installing the diverse route or whatever it may be that improves the resiliency and redundancy of the network. And if CenturyLink is taking on the responsibility of maintaining that going forward, then maybe that would alleviate some of that concern. I don't know.
Well, that was kind of where I was going with it, Daryl. That's what I kind of thought. But then I also thought that might give the authorities more ability to say, not necessarily what's flowing through it, but a little better control if we are providing soup to nuts on the line.
Anyone else have any thoughts or comments on this proposal? So we do have several others to go through, but I don't want to cut off discussion if there's more to be said. Okay, good discussion though. I really appreciate it. Proposal 2 is to change the definition of basic emergency service. As of right now, the way it reads is that basic emergency service means the aggregation and transportation of a 911 call directly to a point of interconnection with a governing body or PSAP, regardless of the technology used to provide the service. The unintended consequence of the way that was worded is that as long as the 911 call is delivered to any PSAP in the state, it is not considered an outage. Whereas I think what was really intended was that if it's not getting to the correct PSAP because of some sort of network issue, then that is an outage. So to address that, I'm suggesting that we just replace the word a with the appropriate. On our first call, we had some alternate suggestions on wording there. Based on the location of the caller was one of the suggestions. So I wanted to see if people have had some time to think about this, if you have some alternate ideas for how we can improve the wording of this. And Joe has his hand up.
I kind of like some of the wording that I think it was Matt and Jeff were working on at the end of the last meeting, suggesting. But the other thing is, I also think that something that's important to have notification of is if like, for example, if you have in the Estes Valley, you have diverse links, you have one link cut, that should be an impairment of service that you get notification of, so that they know that if they lose one more link, they're in trouble. And so I think that might be it. That's not exactly what we're talking about, but it's kind of, I think, related. Service isn't completely out, but you're down to one strand.
Gotcha. And Matt's got his hand up, but I think one of the other things we talked about was notification of PSAPs that they are receiving calls that have been rerouted from another PSAP. So if one PSAP goes down or it becomes isolated and CenturyLink has to route those calls to an alternate PSAP, some sort of notification needs to go to that alternate PSAP to let them know, hey, you're now receiving calls for this other jurisdiction. Matt?
Yeah, my recommendation was to use designated instead of appropriate.
Right.
And I think also demarcation point. That's kind of the
Yeah, that's
Remember
correct,
that.
Joe. Yep.
And I'm just writing some notes here. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, designated sounds like a good word. I'd also like there to be some sort of, as directed by the PSAP. So in the event that a PSAP can't take a call and has asked us to reroute a call, that's not considered the not appropriate PSAP and therefore an outage under your rule.
Right. So let's say they have some sort of electrical problem or their phone system has gone down in the PSAP. That's not a network issue, but they still need you to route their calls to someone else. It's not a basic emergency service outage. That's kind of the thing you're talking about, Tim?
Yes.
So that would still be designated by the governing body or PSAPs. We just have to put some language about that.
Right. And not all of it necessarily has to be built into the definition of basic emergency service either. Some of that might be in the outage reporting rules as to which outages are reportable and which ones are not. Any other comments or thoughts on this item? Okay. Proposal number 3 was prorated billing from outages. This is to add a requirement that the BESP prorate the bill sent to the 911 governing body for basic emergency service outages that in excess of a specific time period. In my initial proposal or my initial presentation on this, I said 30 minutes in duration so that the governing body isn't paying for service it didn't receive. And I also noted in the initial presentation that this is to some extent built into the CenturyLink tariff. It's a 4-hour minimum time period before this kicks in for certain types of outages. But that's so this is kind of an altered version of what's already in the tariff. Has anyone had any additional thoughts or comments on this? Joe, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, essentially negotiated the price of tariff also looking at what their costs were and what their risks and liability were. And so I think it would be unfair of them to put in a provision in rule which changed their obligations under the tariff. If we did that, I think they'd have an obligation to amend their tariff. I mean, we outlawed slavery about 50, 60 years ago. And so they're entitled to make a profit on the work they perform. And we negotiated that in good faith. And so we need to keep that faith in the rules.
So just to make sure I understand where you're coming from, you are opposed to this proposal, or you're in favor of this proposal, but believe that CenturyLink would need to renegotiate the pricing and the tariff to cover their additional costs?
I think the time period has to match what's in the tariff that we negotiated.
I see. So you're suggesting that the rule needs to match the 4-hour time period that's in the tariff?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we negotiated. We shouldn't come in and say, oh, but we're the PUC and we can make a rule and change what we negotiated and, whatever effect that has on the bargain that they made with us is their tough luck. I don't think that's the precedent we want to set.
Okay. Any other comments or thoughts? Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do think it should match that time frame in the tariff. I feel like that came to be a reasonable period of time, and the circumstances that surround it should be mirrored in the rule. I wouldn't want to see there be a different standard in our tariff versus in the PUC rule. And I also didn't, and I appreciate you changing this a little bit, because I didn't want it to be where every reportable outage, even though many of those reportable outages aren't really a 911 outage, it's our originating service provider outage that caused this incident. And so I want to make sure that we keep this as the BESP outage, just like we have in the tariff. And so I think if those mirror, you wouldn't see any objection from us.
Yeah, and Tim, you and I talked about a little bit about some of the wording that we could use to try to ensure that this only applies to basic emergency service outages and not other types of outages. And that's going to be, I think it's going to be a kind of a tricky tightrope to walk, but it's one that can be done.
Yeah.
Any other comments or thoughts on this? Okay. Proposal 4, create a new section of the rules outlining what must be included in a basic emergency service offering. And I don't think most of this is I don't think most of this is controversial. It's taking rules that already exist and moving them into one section so that theoretically in the future, if another company wanted to become a basic emergency service provider in Colorado, they would be able to see in one section what they would have to include in their service offering. But one of the things I would like to include as a required feature of a basic emergency service offering is the ability to transfer 911 calls to and from providers in neighboring states. Lumen would need some time I know it's already on the radar for Lumen to work on that for their EZNet, but that's something that I think we lost that ability when we went from the legacy 911 network to the EZNet. And so if there are other types of things that we think would be fair to put in that section, maybe things like the providers need to use NENA-approved ALI schema for delivery of location information to the PSAP, that sort of thing. I would be interested in hearing about that either at this meeting, or you can send me comments separately. And Joe has his hand up. Joe, go ahead.
The first question is, on part number 3, is that, for example, the ability, if a 911 call from Texas somehow gets routed to Boulder will be able to transfer it to them? Or is it more, you have LEDAs up against the northern border with Wyoming, and Wyoming, there's a telephone company across the border, or a PSAP, that they can transfer it to that PSAP?
It's about cross-border transfers.
And we've lost that now?
Apparently so, yes. That's my understanding.
We've never had it. Yeah, so sorry, this is Kimberly. So we've never been able to transfer 911 to 911 across state lines. You can go 911 to 10-digit. So when we have to transfer a call up to Wyoming, it's 911 to 10-digit. You can't do 911 to 911.
And maybe this depends on where in the state. It was my understanding, and maybe I just misunderstood, that the Eastern Plains PSAPs that border Kansas were able to transfer calls to the 911 system in Kansas prior to the EZNet.
I think Lumen would have to answer that. I wasn't aware of that, but I know of Wyoming, we've never been able to.
Okay.
And with New Mexico and Utah and Arizona, you were charged a long distance.
Yeah, we would get long distance anytime. Well, we would get long distance any transfer up here in northern Colorado.
That's correct. That's how it works. Kimberly is correct. And that's true of Daryl of Burlington could not transfer 911 to 911 before the ESNet cut over.
Well,
Okay.
AT&T
Well, I was
is
misinformed there, and I apologize. Joe, go ahead.
AT&T is the provider in Kansas. Is Lumen the provider in Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico? I think they are. Some of the other states we're dealing with.
They are, and we are working on where we can control things to try to make some things happen in Wyoming. That's a work in progress. It will take considerably more work to do anything in Kansas because that's AT&T. It's theoretically, it's something downstream that can, and I'm sure will happen, but not in the immediate future. Now, Wyoming, though, back to that, we are trying to configure some things to make that work, even though Wyoming is probably at least 2 years away from some type of ESNet on their part.
The other question I had is whether we want to put in the rules that the price would be by concurrent session, since it was lines, then it was selective router database entry, now it's concurrent sessions. Is that something we want to put hard and fast in the rules, or something that we may want to change over time?
So the reason why I want to put it in the rules is because it's already hard and fast in the statute that that's how we distribute the state 911 surcharge, which the purpose of is to reimburse the 911 governing bodies for the tariff rates they pay. I'm sorry? Okay. Sorry, I think we've got some crosstalk there.
In which community?
Okay. Anyway, so if another provider were to come in and were to offer a tariff based on number of fire stations in a district, I don't know what they would base it on, number of, where they go back to what CenturyLink used to use, which is number of records in the alley database. That would make it extremely difficult to reimburse the 911 governing bodies based on what's in the statute, because the statute says that the money has to be distributed based on number of concurrent sessions. So yes, it is hardwiring it into the rules, but it really can't change unless it also changes in the statute anyway. So if the statute changes, you have to update the rules. I'm sorry, Joe, what was that?
It's already harder wired.
Harder wired, yes. So that's my reasoning for wanting to put that in there. And, as it happens, it's actually easier to change things in rules than it is to change it in statute. So if we do decide to change that at some point in the future, it's not as heavy of a lift as it's going to be to change it in the rules, or excuse me, in the statute.
So, I'm sorry, to go back to number 3. If we're putting that in the rules, I mean, we have a provision about diverse paths where feasible or practical or something like that. Maybe that's the kind of language we should have in your point 3, because at least in some cases, it's not just CenturyLink, it's another party, and maybe some technology issues. I guess NINA I3 doesn't mean we can just connect up and everything works. So,
well, and our rules already contain that language where it says that there will be diverse paths used where feasible, but it doesn't define what feasible means, which basically means it's an aspirational rule rather than prescriptive.
Right. So what I'm suggesting is where we're saying that you have connection in neighboring states, perhaps that should also be where feasible rather than must be included.
I see what you're talking about, just for the interstate call transfers.
Yeah.
Well, and I was operating under under bad information because I was under the impression that the 911 centers on the border all had previously had the ability to transfer calls with alley to a 911 line on the other side of the border, but apparently that's not the case. So I think something along the lines of what you've suggested, Joe, would make sense. Any other thoughts or comments on proposal number 4? Okay. Proposal 5, specify that text to 911 delivery via interim methods not delivered via the basic emergency service network are exempt from commission rules. This is really a clarification more than anything, because we already exempt delivery of text to 911 via interim methods, but we don't define what interim methods means. So we need to clarify that in the rules. So I'm not sure if this would be an adjustment to the definition of basic emergency service, which is where that exemption exists, or if this is found elsewhere in the rules. But I would like to clarify that. Does anybody have any questions or comments or suggestions or limericks? Dad jokes? And really what this, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, an interim method for text to 911 means that it is being delivered to you via any delivery system that is not the same way you get your voice calls. So right now, all of the PSAPs in Colorado that have text to 911 are using interim methods, meaning they're getting the calls, they're getting the text calls delivered to them directly by the TCC or through an intermediary from the TCC. And we exempted that when we did our last rules update, because we did not want to have to certify all of those different companies as basic emergency service providers. But if they're being delivered over the ESI net or delivered via the same method that voice calls are, then we do want to include that, or at least that was the thinking back then. Joe?
I was just going to put it down. Yeah, it was the originating service providers that I think were concerned that their delivery, if we included text and video and other types of things, forward looking in the definition of what basic emergency service could include, that we would then make them through their alternative current interim delivery of text to 911 basic emergency service providers. And of course they didn't like that.
Right. And I think there was some discussion back at the time as well about intermediary aggregation service providers and whether they would be considered basic emergency service providers or not, because they do aggregate and transport calls, but they're not really routing calls to the PSAP. And the PSAP is not the final delivery point for them. There was a final proposal that was proposal number 6. The general idea of proposal 6 was to create through the tariff a funding mechanism for the EZNet Users Group or the Colorado Coalition of Authorities or whatever agency or organization could represent the 911 governing bodies to spend that money on things like a statewide training program or the resource center or other things that might be of benefit to 911s on a statewide basis, but otherwise don't really fit into the tariff. The day following the presentation that I made in August, the CCOA discussions were ongoing, and there was a meeting of the participants in those discussions, and there really didn't seem to be a consensus that this was an idea that they could get behind. And because of that, I've pulled that proposal, so that's no longer on the slate. So now we went from 6 to 5 proposals. So that's all I have to present, but we're almost to the top of the hour. But if anybody has any other thoughts or suggestions regarding what we should or consider including in the 911 reliability rulemaking, I would be thankful to hear it from you now, or you can send me an email or call me later. Does anybody have anything else they would like to add? Matt?
let's say CCOA gets created and is on its feet. We would then have to revisit with another rulemaking proceeding to encompass that instead of taking care of it sort of proactively now.
Potentially, yes. If there's nothing in the rules that allow for that mechanism, and if at some point CCOA decides that they want to have that dedicated funding mechanism, then we would probably need to revisit the rules. But it would be a smaller rulemaking if that's the only thing we're changing.
I guess I just wonder why not just leave it in now and leave room for it to happen, sort of as an enabling regulation.
Okay. Joe?
So if there's a provision in the rules that it doesn't say the commission must do this, but the commission may do this, that would be there as a capability in case we needed to. Although I think in general it'd be better to address this through the statute first.
We have a little bit of a chicken and the egg issue with CCOA and the funding. And I kind of see this possible regulation as a way to resolve that. To point to that, to say this is not necessarily going to be an additional cost burden on the authorities.
And Kimberly had to leave, but I know some of her concerns, and I think, I can't really answer these concerns without doing a lot of research up front, which I'm happy to do, but I just can't answer it for this meeting, which is if it's being paid for through the tariff, does that put any restrictions on how the money can be spent?
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that the CCOA group has been talking about is the ability to hire a lobbyist like the Sheriff's Association or the Fire Chiefs Association has. And I think, concerns about whether the money could be spent on something like that, I think are valid concerns, and I just don't have an answer for it right now.
And there's an intersection with the FCC rulemaking.
Right. Although I have to say, if the CCOA is being funded through membership fees, membership dues that are being paid for with ETC revenue, I think the FCC rules still create a problem, potentially.
I guess my request would be that we not back shelf it completely. I mean, we're still very early in the process for both of these issues.
Right. I think what I could possibly do is work on some language that enables the commission to do something like that in the future without requiring it for 2022's rate setting proceeding, so that it'll be there, that can be invoked in the future with, if necessary, without invoking it now. I think that's going to be difficult to write, but I'll do my best. And if anybody has, by the way, if anybody would like me to consider specific language, I'm definitely not going to say no to that. If you want to send me your thoughts on what how the language could work, either for this proposal or for any of the proposals, I would be very happy to take a look at that. Vicki?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention, so you said this is 2022, and like, for example, funding for the Resource Center is going to sunset first quarter of 2023. So it would be, it would be really cutting it down to the wire if we didn't have some sort of avenue, even if it's the may concept instead of shall.
Right, and I think one of the concerns that was voiced at the CCOA meeting was that at least the people who were speaking up that day at that meeting wanted to keep it a voluntary association, whereas if it's built into the tariff, everybody pays. The benefit of that is that it allows the commission to then reimburse those costs through the state 911 surcharge. The drawback is that everybody's a member whether they want to be or not. And I think they were a little concerned about that approach, this doing kind of a mandatory approach to it. But if the CCOA gets up and running and gets lots of members and gets enough revenue, it could potentially fund the resource center starting in 2023, even without this sort of funding mechanism through the tariff.
True.
Jackie, you had your hand up next.
I do, and my only comment was I'd just rather see something like this in rules than going back to legislation for it. I think we're walking a fine line there.
Yeah. Joe?
I believe the resource center would probably be a proper expense under the FCC rules, because they did say in the report and order that subsidization of other jurisdictions within your state is acceptable. You know, for the type of permitted expenses, I think they fall within that. I'm not sure about lobbying and maybe some other things.
Right.
I'm sorry, I meant to take that down.
Mm-hmm. So if I try to split the difference here and try to build in a funding mechanism that could be invoked at some future date, but doesn't have to be invoked now, does anybody have any strong objections to that approach, or do you have any thoughts as to why we shouldn't do that? Or is that kind of the good compromise that we can agree to? Joe?
Is CTIA on the call?
I do not know. I haven't seen anybody that looks like they are from there.
Because they might oppose it.
Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, well, with that, we are 5 minutes over, so I'm going to go ahead and close this down. But thank you very much, everybody. This was a really good discussion. This helps me immensely. I took copious notes. If you have any other thoughts, comments, suggestions, draft language, anything you would like me to look at or consider for this rulemaking for the initial proposal, please send it to me. And of course, after the commission issues it as a notice of proposed rulemaking, anybody who wishes to can submit comments. So this isn't the end of the process. This is just the beginning. But I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Daryl.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Daryl.
Daryl.